In turn, there seemed no limit to the novel applications for this cheap and useful mineral. In 1779, Abraham Darby, grandson of the first Abraham Darby, the third, built a bridge of iron across the Severn River. Crystal Palace, building erected in Hyde Park, London for the Great Exhibition of 1851, made of iron and glass, like a gigantic greenhouse. It was a symbol of the industrial age. In 1851, Londoners marveled at the Crystal Palace, a huge greenhouse made entirely of iron and glass and large enough to enclose the tallest trees. The availability of cheap iron made the mass production of objects such as guns, hardware, and tools appealing. However, fitting together these parts of these products required a great deal of labor. To reduce labor costs, manufacturers turned to the idea of interchangeable parts. By the mid-19th century, interchangeable parts manufacturing had been adopted in the manufacture of firearms, farm equipment, and sewing machines. At the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851, Europeans called it the American system of manufactures. In the next 100 years, the use of machinery to mass produce consumers' items was to become the hallmark of American industry. The steam engine. Steam engine, a machine that turns the energy released by burning fuel into motion. Thomas Newcomen built the first crude but workable steam engine in 1712. James Watt vastly improved his device in the 1760s and 1770s. Steam power was later applied to moving machinery in factories and to powering ships and locomotives. In the history of the world, there had been a number of periods of great technological inventiveness and economic growth, but in all previous cases, the dynamism eventually faltered. The Industrial Revolution, in contrast, has only accelerated. One reason has been the increased interactions between scientists, technicians, and business people. Another has been access to source of cheap energy, namely fossil fuels. The first machine to transform fossil fuel into mechanical energy was the steam engine, a device that set the Industrial Revolution apart from all previous periods of growth and innovation. The Newcomen and Watt engine. Before the 18th century, deep mines filled with water faster than horses could pump it out. Then, between 1702 and 1712, Thomas Newcomen developed the first practical steam engine, a crude but effective device that could pump water out of mines as fast as 4 horses could run a day and night without getting tired. The Newcomen engine's voracious appetite for fuel mattered little to coal mines, where fuel was cheap, but it made the engine too costly for others to use for other uses. In 1764, James Watt, a maker of scientific instruments at Glasgow University in Scotland, was asked to report the university's model Newcomen engine. Watt realized that the engine wasted fuel because the cylinder had to be alternately heated and cooled. He developed a separate condenser, a vessel into which the steam was allowed to escape after it had done its work, leaving the cylinder always hot and the condenser always cold. Watt patented his idea in 1769. He enlisted to help of the he enlisted the help of the iron manufacturer Matthew Boulton to turn his invention into a commercial product. Their first engines were sold to pump water out of copper and tin mines, where fuel was too costly for Newcomen engines. In 1781, Watt invented the sun and planet gear, which turned the back and forth action of the piston into rotary motion. This allowed steam engines to power machinery in flour and cotton mills, pottery manufacturers, and other industries. Because there seemed almost no limit to the amount of coal in the ground, steam generated energy appeared to be an inexhaustible source of power, and steam engines could be used where animal, wind, and water power were lacking. Steamboats and ships. Inspired by the success of Watt's engine, several inventors put steam engines on boats. The first commercially successful steamboat was Robert Fulton's North River, which steamed up and down the Hudson River between New York City and Albany, New York in 1807. Soon steamboats were launched on the Ohio and Mississippi River and the Mississippi. Gateways to the Midwest. In the 1820s, the Erie Canal linked the Atlantic seaboard and with the Great Lakes and opened Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois to European settlement. By 1830, some 300 steamboats piled the Mississippi and its tributaries. The United States was fast becoming a nation that moved by water. Ocean-going steam-powered ships were much more difficult to build than riverboats, for the first steam engines used so much coal that no ship could carry more than a few days' supply. The Savannah, which crossed the Atlantic in 1819, was a sailing ship with an auxiliary steam engine that was used for only 90 hours of its 29-day trip. Engineers soon developed more efficient engines, and in 1838 two steamers, the Great Western and the Sirius, crossed the Atlantic on steam power alone. Railroads. After Watt's patent expired in 1800, inventors experimented with lighter, more powerful, high-pressure engines, an idea Watt had rejected as too dangerous. In 1804, Richard Trevithick built an engine that consumed 12 times less coal than Newcomen's and 3 times less than Watt's. With it, he built several steam-powered vehicles able to travel on roads or rails. By the 1820s, England had many railways on which horses pulled heavy wagons. In 1829, the owners of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway organized a contest between steam-powered locomotives and horse-drawn wagons. George Stephenson and his son Robert won the contest with their locomotive Rocket, which pulled a 20-ton train at up to 30 miles, 48 kilometers per hour. After that triumph, a railroad building mania swept Britain. In the late 1830s, as passenger traffic soared, entrepreneurs built lines between the major cities and even to small towns. Railroads were far cheaper, faster, and more comfortable than stagecoaches, and millions of people got in the habit of traveling. Railroads in America. In the United States, entrepreneurs built railroads as quickly and cheaply as possible. By the 1840s, 6,000 miles, 10,000 kilometers, of track radiated from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. In the 1850s, 21,000 miles, 34,000 kilometers, of new track were laid, much of it westward across the Appalachians to Memphis, St. Louis, and Chicago. After 1856, the trip from New York to Chicago, which had once taken 3 weeks by boat and on horseback, could be made in 48 hours. It was the railroads that opened up in the Midwest, turning the vast prairie into farms to feed the industrial cities of the eastern United States. Railroads in Europe. Railways also triggered the industrialization of Europe. Belgium, independent since 1830, quickly copied the British railways. In France and Prussia, construction was delayed until the mid-1840s. When it began, however, it not only satisfied the long-standing need for transportation, but also stimulated the iron machinery and construction industries. Communication over wires. Electric telegraph, a device for rapid, long-distance transmission of information over an electric wire. It was introduced in England and North America in the 1830s and 1840s and replaced telegraph systems that utilized visual signals such as semaphores. After the Italian scientist Alessandro Volta invented the battery in 1800, making it possible to produce an electric current, many inventors tried to apply electricity to communication. The first practical electric telegraph systems were developed almost simultaneously in England and America. In 1837, in England, Charles Wheatstone and William Cooke introduced a 5-wire telegraph, while the American Samuel Morse introduced a code of dots and dashes that could be transmitted over a single wire. The railroad companies allowed telegraph companies to string wires along the tracks in exchange for the right to send telegrams from station to station announcing the departure and arrival of trains. Such messages made railroads much safer as well as more efficient. By the late 1840s, telegraph wires crossed the eastern United States and western Europe. In 1851, the first submarine telegraph cable was laid across the English Channel from England to France. It was the beginning of a network that eventually connected the entire globe. No longer were communications limited to the speed of a sailing ship, a galloping horse, or a fast-moving train. Section Review. A series of technological and organizational innovations transformed manufacturing, transportation, and communication. Mechanization, pioneered by Wedgwood, meant that work formerly done by skilled craftsmen was divided into many simple tasks assigned to workers in factories. New machines allowed the mass production of cotton, yarn, and cloth. The use of coke and new machines made iron cheap and abundant. Steam engines provided power for mines, factories, ships, and railroads. Electricity found its first practical application in telegraphy. The impact of the early Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution led to profound changes in society, politics, and the economy. At first, the changes were local. Some people became wealthy and built mansions, while others lived in slums with polluted water and air. By the mid 19th century, the worst local effects were being alleviated and cities became cleaner and healthier. Replacing them were more complex problems: business cycles, labor conflicts, and the transformation of entire regions into industrial landscapes. At the global level, industrialization empowered the nations of Western Europe and North America at the expense of the rest of the world. The new industrial cities. The most dramatic environmental change brought about by industrialization occurred in the towns. Never before had towns grown so fast. London, one of the largest cities in Europe in 1700 with 500,000 inhabitants, grew to 959,000 by 1800 and to 2,363,000 by 1850. It was then the largest city the world had ever known. Manchester, a small town of 20,000 in 1758, reached 400,000 a century later, a 20-fold increase. New York City, already 100,000 strong in 1815, reached 600,000, including Brooklyn, in 1850. In some areas, towns merged and formed megalopolises such as Greater London, the English Midlands, Central Belgium, and the Ruhr district of Germany. A great deal of money went into the building of fine homes, churches, museums, and theaters in wealthy neighborhoods. Much of the beauty of London dates from the time of the Industrial Revolution, yet by all accounts the industrial cities grew much too fast, and much of the growth occurred in the poorest neighborhoods. As poor migrants streamed in from the countryside, developers built the cheap, shoddy row horses for them to rent, the Nassau Senior described. Urban environments. Sudden population growth caused serious urban environmental problems. Town dwellers recently arrived from the country brought country ways with them. People threw their sewage and trash out the windows to be washed down the gutters in the streets. The poor kept pigs and chickens, the rich kept horses, and pedestrians stepped into the street at their own risk. Air pollution was from burning coal, a problem since the 16th century, got steadily worse. People drank water drawn from wells and rivers contaminated by sewage and industrial runoff. The River Irwell, which ran through Manchester, was, in the words of one visitor, considerably less river than a flood of liquid manure. "Every day that I live," wrote an American visitor to Manchester, "I thank heaven that I am not a poor man with a family in England." In his poem, Milton, William Blake, 1757, 1827, expressed the revulsion of sensitive people at the spoliation of England's mountains green and pleasant pastures. "And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?" Railroads invaded the towns, bringing noise and smoke into densely populated neighborhoods. Railroad companies built their stations as close to the heart of the city as they could. On the outskirts of cities, railroad yards, sidings, and repair shops covered acres of land, surrounded by miles of warehouses and workers' housing.